from 6 to 8. Today's scripture reading is one that I've actually wanted to preach on since I first came to this church 2.5 years ago. In 2008, I almost wrote 1998, that makes no sense. It's going to be in a second. In 2008, I was weighing options for where to work. That fall, that summer I'd spent in Cambodia and Thailand, and that fall I'd spent 2 years by that point looking for different churches to work at. Some large, some in the Midwest, some on the East Coast. I'd graduated from seminary in 2006 and I didn't know where I was going to be. And that fall, I had come here to do an interview in 2008. However, I will be honest, I heard about the job, and after visiting the church website in 2008, wasn't so sure I was coming by. But I did. Braved through it, came. Now the website looks awesome. I hope you visited every day. Visit it every day. It's so pretty. But I had a friend who lived in the area. I said, the website. They said, no, the people are great at that church. And I was like, trust you. And the interesting thing is I came here when I'd been here originally about 10 years earlier. In 1998, I was in a wedding that happened at St. Cross. And they got married at St. Cross, and they actually had the reception at what was formerly Barnaby's, but it's now the Bellamar Hotel, right? I drive by there every day. It's so bizarre. So 10 years ago, in 2008, 1998, I was here. You didn't know me then, but you might have seen me on the pier getting my picture taken with 8 other bridesmaids. We were all in gold silk floor-length raw silk gowns when we were running around the pier. She had a very artistic photographer, my friend, who was the bride. We actually joke that it was like a little wedding in the middle of a big photo shoot. We had to be ready at 1. The wedding was at 7. So if you look really hard on Facebook, you actually will find a picture of me on the Hermosa Pier, like going like this, with like a bouquet and my hair in a bouffant, and it was great. So that was my first experience in the South Bay, in a bridesmaid dress, running around on the Hermosa Pier. And as I began my process of discernment when I came back 10 years later, and it's a process of discernment, by the way, we all should be on as Christians. We're always constantly asking, where does God want me to be? And who does God want me to be when I get there? So I was asking myself those questions. And as I thought through, I actually sat in the Nordstrom's in the mall, the Galleria on Artesia, and there's like a coffee shop at the Nordstrom's, and I actually had my journal out after my first interview here, and I went there and I got some coffee. I know, shocking. I ordered nice coffee, it was shocking. And then I wrote in my journal kind of some of the reasons, what I was thinking about, what I was struggling with, where does God want me, what's happening. And I came up with some reasons. You always have a list of like the good reasons, the bad reasons, and my sermon isn't about the bad reasons. It's not about the no's, don't worry. It's about the pros of why I was thinking of coming here after meeting many of you. So my list looked like this. The first one on the list was, wow, meeting those people on the committee, so cool. So cool. They seemed to genuinely care about me. They seemed to care about what I was about and my process. Before I'd been interviewed by committees, it felt more like a grilling, Like, what is your belief? What do you think about this? And I've sat in a room with 9 people before where I've just been like, shrinking backwards in these interviews. And the search committee was amazing. And so that was my first reason. I thought, man, if the search committee is this cool, people really must be cool at this church. The second thing I thought of, the pros, the reason I wanted to consider this job, was that it was a smaller church. Now, I know for you this isn't a smaller church, but keep in mind I was interviewing a church of 6,000 people. That was my other option at that point. And my last church was 4,000 people. Those are big churches. So this church was in comparison smaller, but it meant that I could preach and do more. None of the other jobs I was looking at with the large evangelical churches would have allowed me to preach, well, because I'm a woman, but also, just a little slight theological thing, but also because when you're in a larger church, you're more of a specialized occupation. You do one thing and one thing only. But at a church like this, I'm able to do a lot of different things and explore. And that was my second reason. My third reason for wanting to think about taking this job was the theological openness. that I didn't have to hide any of my questions or any of my thoughts or any of my doubts, that people had wonderful openness to their exploration of God, their exploration of the Bible, and it was really refreshing. I could be myself here. Number 4, there was a rabbi on staff. I just thought that was the coolest thing I'd ever heard of. Never heard of that before. So cool. We get to kind of interact with our Jewish history in that way. But the 5th reason, the title of the sermon, the 5th reason that I decided on in my pros list to work at Manhattan Beach Community Church as the Minister of Youth and Families was the installation in the narthex. Now, for those of you who don't know church lingo, the narthex is the area that you enter into at the church. Have you ever seen the installation that's on this side of the wall as you walk in? It's a wooden box. It has a rock on it. It has this rock on it. I took it, sorry, I'll put it back. Not gonna steal it. It's dedicated to Fletcher L. Walker, I don't know who that is, by Mr. and Mrs. Wendell L. Miller, right? Former Manhattan Beach community minister from 1957 or 56 to 1967. He was the pastor that was here when this building was built. For those of you who've taken my confirmation class and looked at John Calhoun's book and account of the cross in the sand, he's the pastor that looks like Colonel Sanders. So, a little information. So on the box, if you look at it in the back, and you're all gonna do it now, aren't you? Yeah. And now if you're on Facebook with me, I've had that picture on my Facebook account for the last couple of weeks. On the box, it says, "For him that is without sin." And then on the top of it, it has this rock placed. And I was happy to note that it was a little dusty, which meant it hadn't been used. And this, the plaque reads for this, it says, donated by sinners, Allie and Frank O'Leary, 2/14/91. I don't know who they are, or I know probably of them, but you know, they're sinners. I love it. It's great. So I thought, why not do a sermon based on this plaque, this wonderful dedication that is the 5th reason that I thought this might be a church that fits me. Now, just so you know, there's a controversy to this passage that sometimes if you look in your text, what it will be saying around this passage is that this is not in the earliest manuscripts. So sometimes there's scriptural textual notes like that. We don't need to worry about that too much. The early church fathers had used this text extra biblically, so we know that it was a story that was going around during that time, but it is a little bit of a textual conundrum. But the reason why I find these verses so fascinating and this biblical story so compelling is that this story is a radical reordering of how to deal with sin in the kingdom that Jesus is creating. A radical new way to look at women during that time, and a radical new way to reorder how we deal with people who don't do what we want them to do. What that plaque communicates to me, and I hope it communicates to you, is that this church gets it. That discipleship in the church is one of changing lives through the transformative grace, not by biblical bullying. Not by biblical bullying. That through grace, we are saved. And there is no more powerful story in Scripture that embodies the truth of the extravagant welcome that the UCC, the denomination that we're affiliated with, so powerfully puts forth, and that's this: no matter who you are or where you are on life's journey, you are welcome here. That's the mantra of the UCC. That's the mantra of our church. No matter where you've come, no matter who you are, no matter what happened before you stepped foot in this church, on those doors, through that entrance, no matter what happened, you are welcome here. You are welcome here. Let me walk through the biblical parts of this lesson for a little bit. We don't need to worry about the male gender issue. I know it says for him that is without sin, and all the women in here will be like, that doesn't mean me. Well, Jesus is talking to men. It's more of a gender issue with the adjective, nominative that's being used. I won't bore you with the details. Suffice it to say, we're all responsible for it. The cultural background is Jesus is doing what rabbis do. He's publicly teaching. That's how we're introduced to this passage. He's on the Mount of Olives. From the Mount of Olives, you can see the Dead Sea, and you can see something called the Herodian. The Herodian is a stadium built by Herod. It's been excavated, and many think in its heyday it seated 500,000 people. What you need to know about Herod is that Herod makes Bill Gates seem like a really cute guy with a paper route, okay? So we all think that, oh, we're the only ones that have dealt with power and money, and no. So Jesus is in this place teaching his followers who have come to see him. The Mount of Olives also serves for many places in the Old Testament where God is speaking of doing a new thing. A new thing. A lot of the prophetic writings, including Jeremiah, have God doing a new thing on the Mount of Olives. Jesus will ascend from the Mount of Olives. So this is a very interesting place. And what you need to know about the background of the Old Testament, as Rick read it, is that the Pharisees bring this woman and they say, according to the Old Testament law, you need to do this. What are you going to do, Jesus? Well, the fascinating part is if you read the actual Old Testament law, Leviticus 20:10 or Deuteronomy 22:22, you see that actually in a case of adultery, both the man and the woman are stoned. Both the man and the woman are supposed to be stoned. So they've twisted the law a bit, haven't they? For their own devices. What do you think? Maybe. I have a few other issues with this text that I hope you have as well. The first one is, where is the man? Right? Do people commit adultery alone? Not during that time. There's no computers. I don't want to get into it. I'm just saying, during this time, you didn't commit adultery alone. So where's the man? Where's her accomplice? Number two, why did they have to bring her before Jesus publicly? Now keep in mind that she's probably half naked. And keep in mind, this is the Middle East we're talking about. How much shame would that have brought on her? How much degradation would that have been for her? They could have sequestered her in private and said, Jesus, we have this woman. Let's go talk about this. But they brought her forth to a public place surrounded by men. And the third thing I have an issue with, we caught her in the act. How does that work? There's no texts. There's no emails going around. There's no reporters sussing things out. Like, how do you get caught doing something so private? Maybe this is a setup. Did you ever think of that? Maybe it's a setup. Jesus senses some of these issues as well, some of these discrepancies. And his dilemma is this. If he were to say, yes, stone this sinful woman, he would be held accountable to the Roman law. Because the Jews at that point, the Pharisees who had power under Jewish law, were occupied by who? Rome. And they had to adhere to Roman law, which is why you need Pilate to kill Jesus. They need the Roman law to oversee anything that involves the death penalty. And for Rome, adultery is not a death penalty issue. So he would have probably been dealt with by Roman law if he'd agreed with the Jewish law. Secondly, if he would have said, no, set her free, right? Then he would have been following Roman authority, the occupying authority. And man, the Pharisees would have just had a field day with him theologically. They would have gone after his ministry. So he's in a no-win situation. And there's a particularly fun play on words here. The one who is without sin can cast the first stone. In this pulpit, I've talked before about the idea of sin, the kind of visualization of sin that we have, that we get from the New Testament. And it's a word that comes from archery. It's a word that comes from war. And it basically means when you miss the mark, right? So sin is that we're aiming for something and we miss the mark, right? So this is sort of what Jesus is saying. If you never miss the mark, you can aim the stone. If you never miss the mark, you can aim the stone. Now, I don't know about you, but I often miss the mark. Someone laughed. It's true. I really do. Raise your hand if you've never done anything wrong in your whole entire life.